There is a quiet moment after awakening when the world begins to sound different. Not louder, but emptier. The laughter in crowded rooms feels rehearsed. The chatter about weather, status, and trends becomes a distant hum. And suddenly, the awakened one realizes, most conversations aren't about connection, but about distraction. Alan Watts often said that awakening is not about acquiring new knowledge, but about seeing through the illusions that once felt real. When that veil lifts, small talk, once a social necessity, becomes like noise in a temple. The awakened doesn't avoid it out of arrogance, but out of reverence for silence, for depth, for truth. To the awakened, every word carries weight. Speech is no longer a tool for filling empty spaces, but for expressing something sacred. They have tasted the stillness that lies beneath thought, and anything less than authenticity feels heavy, almost painful. It's not that they dislike people, it's that they can no longer pretend. Alan once described this shift as the moment when you stop being hypnotized by words. The awakened sees how language often hides rather than reveals, how it builds walls instead of bridges. So they fall quiet, not in withdrawal, but in awareness. In ordinary conversation, people exchange opinions like coins, but the awakened no longer deals in currency that loses value the moment it's spent. They prefer silence, not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally understand that truth does not need a shout. To them, silence is not emptiness, it's presence. It's the space where understanding blossoms without effort. When the awakened does speak, their words come slowly, deliberately, not to impress, but to reveal something honest, unfiltered, alive. And yet, this avoidance of small talk often makes them seem distant, detached, or even strange. But what others perceive as aloofness is actually deep listening. The awakened hears not just words, but the emotion beneath them, the fear, the longing, the confusion hidden behind the polite smiles. They recognize the unconscious patterns in speech, the way people talk not to connect, but to escape themselves. Alan Watts might say they've woken up from a social trance, and once awake, you cannot go back to dreaming. So, the awakened sits quietly in a noisy world, watching, listening, smiling softly. They no longer crave the comfort of constant conversation, because they have found a deeper communion in stillness. To them, a single moment of genuine silence with another soul says more than 1,000 empty words ever could. They avoid small talk not because they have grown apart from humanity, but because they have grown closer to truth, and truth, as Watts would say, doesn't need to be discussed, it only needs to be seen. When Alan Watts spoke about communication, he often reminded us that most people don't really talk to share truth, they talk to avoid it. In the modern world, conversation has become a performance, a ritual of distraction designed to keep silence at bay. The awakened one sees this clearly. They notice how people use words not as bridges, but as barriers, building walls of noise to protect themselves from the stillness that might reveal who they really are. To the awakened, that realization changes everything. Once you've tasted the depth that lies beyond language, the surface-level chatter that once felt normal now feels hollow, like echoes bouncing in an empty hall. This is why small talk feels unbearable to those who have awakened. It's not because they think themselves superior. It's because they've seen the futility of speaking without meaning. In the same way that someone who has heard a symphony cannot find joy in a broken melody, the awakened cannot find comfort in words that dance around truth without touching it. They crave honesty, not the loud kind, but the raw, quiet honesty that exists between pauses. Alan Watts often said that the real language of the universe is not verbal. The awakened understand this. They speak less not because they are empty, but because they have become full of awareness, full of understanding, full of silence. And yet, this silence is not withdrawal. It is alignment. The awakened one senses that small talk thrives on the illusion of separation. You and me, mine and yours. But awakening dissolves that illusion. Once you see that we are all expressions of the same consciousness, words lose their urgency. The awakened doesn't need to prove, persuade, or perform. They have nothing to gain from speaking and nothing to lose from silence. The ego demands to be heard. Awareness has nothing to say. Still, the awakened is not cold or unkind. In fact, they feel more deeply than ever before. They can sense when a conversation is born of loneliness, fear, or confusion. They hear what is not being said, the pain behind the laughter, the insecurity beneath the boasting. And because of that, they often choose silence as an act of compassion. They know that arguing changes nothing, and empty reassurance only deepens illusion. Their quiet is not dismissal, it's understanding. Alan Watts called this the wisdom of insecurity, the acceptance that nothing needs to be forced, not even connection. So the awakened sits in a conversation and smiles gently. They do not resist the flow of words, but neither do they become caught in them. They know that life is speaking through everyone, even through the noise. And sometimes, when the moment is right, a single sentence from their lips can pierce through years of confusion. Not because it is clever, but because it comes from silence. That is why they avoid small talk, because they have learned that true communication begins where words end. Alan Watts often said that most people are terrified of silence because silence reveals the truth. When there are no words, no sound, no distraction, the mind has nowhere to hide. Small talk, in that sense, becomes a form of armor. It fills the empty spaces where truth might slip through. The awakened one recognizes this mechanism instantly because they once used it too. They remember the comfort of meaningless conversation, the illusion of belonging it created. But once consciousness awakens, that illusion shatters. The awakened can no longer take refuge in words, because they now see that silence holds more wisdom than any dialogue ever could. In silence, the awakened has found what words could never deliver: peace. This peace doesn't depend on agreement or validation. It doesn't need to be understood or approved. It simply is. When they listen to others speak endlessly about trivialities, they do not judge. They simply observe how deeply humanity fears stillness. People cling to chatter as though silence were death itself. But the awakened knows the opposite is true. Silence is life. It is the purest form of being, untouched by illusion, unshaken by time. As Watts said, "You are an aperture through which the universe is looking at itself." In silence, that truth becomes undeniable. Small talk loses meaning because the awakened now sees how it feeds the illusion of separation. When someone says, "Lovely weather today," what they truly mean is, "See me, recognize me, validate that I exist." Beneath every casual phrase lies a hidden plea for connection. The awakened feels this, the ache in every word, the quiet desperation to be seen. And because they understand, they respond not with cleverness, but with presence. They don't fill the air with noise. They hold space for truth to emerge naturally. In that moment, the conversation transforms, not through what is said, but through what is felt. This is what makes the awakened different. They communicate without needing to convince. Their energy speaks before their mouth does. People often walk away from them feeling strangely peaceful, even if few words were exchanged. That is because the awakened doesn't engage the personality. They speak to the soul. Alan Watts often described this as the dance between form and emptiness. The awakened has mastered that dance. They can sit in a crowded room, say nothing, and still touch hearts. So, when the awakened avoid small talk, it isn't rejection, it's refinement. They have learned that words can either build walls or open doors. They choose the latter. They speak only when silence cannot say what needs to be said. For them, conversation is sacred, not a performance, but a prayer. Each word carries intention, each pause holds meaning, and each silence becomes an invitation to see, to feel, to awaken. The awakened one eventually realizes that most conversations exist not to share truth, but to maintain the illusion of certainty. People use words to wrap the unknown in comfortable stories. They say things to keep reality predictable, controllable, digestible. Alan Watts often warned that this is the greatest trick of the mind, the attempt to turn the living mystery of existence into a manageable idea. But once awakening cracks that illusion, small talk becomes impossible. The awakened no longer find satisfaction in rehearsed phrases or predictable exchanges. They crave truth, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it leads into silence. To the awakened, truth is not something you tell. It is something you are. Every word they speak comes from alignment, from authenticity, from presence. They have discovered that the real essence of communication has nothing to do with vocabulary and everything to do with vibration. A simple, "I understand," spoken from consciousness carries more healing than 1,000 words said from fear. This is why they often speak slowly, choosing their words carefully, allowing silence to breathe between them. They are not afraid of pauses. They honor them, for it is in the pauses that awareness reveals itself. But for the unawakened, those pauses feel unbearable. They rush to fill the air, to keep energy moving, to silence the stillness that mirrors their own unease. The awakened, however, knows that this unease is the doorway. The silence between two people is where truth hides, waiting to be noticed. That's why the awakened avoids superficial talk, because they can no longer ignore that sacred space. They see how small talk numbs what silence heals. They have learned to listen not to the words themselves, but to the consciousness speaking them. Alan Watts described this as listening without a listener. It means allowing words to flow through you without judgment, without resistance, without trying to fix or interpret. The awakened listens in this way, deeply, openly, without agenda. They no longer hear just stories and opinions, but the energy behind them, the longing, the confusion, the desire to belong. In that awareness, they discover compassion. They see that small talk is not foolishness, but a symptom of humanity's collective forgetfulness, the fear of simply being. So when the awakened avoid small talk, it is not out of impatience or superiority. It is an act of honesty. They can no longer pretend that empty words bring closeness when they actually deepen separation. They choose depth over comfort, authenticity over performance, truth over noise. And in doing so, they remind us, even without saying it, that the most meaningful conversations are not spoken at all. They are felt in silence, in presence, in the spaces where two souls finally remember that they were never strangers. As awakening deepens, even conversation itself begins to transform. What once felt like dialogue now feels like a dance, a subtle exchange of energy, rhythm, and awareness. Alan Watts often compared communication to jazz, spontaneous, fluid, alive in the moment. The awakened no longer plans what to say or how to respond. They simply allow words to arise naturally, like music played without sheet notes. There is no agenda behind their speech, no desire to impress or persuade. Their words flow from the same silence that gives birth to stars, effortless, unforced, free. Because of this, the awakened finds small talk suffocating. It feels mechanical, scripted, repetitive, like trying to dance to a metronome instead of music. In a world where people talk endlessly but rarely say anything, the awakened values depth over noise. They crave the kind of conversation where silence feels as sacred as speech. They are drawn to those rare souls who listen without waiting to reply, who speak from the heart instead of the mask. With such people, every word becomes alive. Every sentence becomes a portal. Yet, even in this understanding, the awakened feels compassion for those who live within small talk. They know it serves a purpose. It keeps the world functioning on the surface, maintains social comfort, and protects fragile egos. The awakened sees the necessity of this stage, just as a child must first learn simple words before speaking poetry. They do not judge it, they simply outgrow it. Alan Watts said that the path of awakening is like peeling an onion, layer after layer until there's nothing left but clarity. The awakened has peeled away the layer of empty speech and found the stillness beneath it. In that stillness, communication takes a new form. It becomes less about words and more about resonance. A glance, a shared silence, a genuine smile. These become the new language of connection. The awakened speaks in frequencies rather than sentences, and only those who are listening with their hearts can understand. To most people, this feels strange, even unsettling, because we are taught that understanding requires explanation. But to the awakened, understanding is wordless. It happens when presence meets presence, when two beings simply are, without the need to pretend. So, when they avoid small talk, it is not a withdrawal from humanity, but an invitation to something deeper. They are silently saying, "Meet me beyond words. Meet me where we are both real." That invitation is always open, though few accept it. Most turn away, uncomfortable with the stillness. But those who stay, those who dare to sit in silence, soon discover that in the absence of small talk, something magnificent emerges: truth. The kind that cannot be said, only felt. The kind that Alan Watts devoted his life to reminding us of, that we are not separate voices in a noisy world, but the same song, remembering itself. When he awakened, one listens to people speak. They no longer hear just the words. They hear the patterns of the mind repeating themselves like an echo. Alan Watts often compared it to listening to a song that never ends, yet no one realizes it's on loop. Most conversations follow this rhythm: opinions recycled, emotions disguised, truths avoided. The awakened recognizes this repetition and feels the weight of it. Every word people say to fill silence becomes a mirror of their own inner noise. And so, the awakened grows quiet, not to escape others, but to remain untouched by the cycle of unconscious speech. In silence, something extraordinary begins to happen. The awakened starts to feel the pulse of life underneath all words, a current of energy flowing beneath the surface of every interaction. They sense how truth is constantly trying to speak through everyone, but most are too busy talking to hear it. They realize that the universe communicates not in sentences, but in synchronicities. In this way, the awakened starts to hear life differently, not through noise, but through stillness. Alan Watts called this the art of listening to the intervals. For in those pauses, between thoughts, between words, between breaths, the entire universe reveals itself. This new way of listening changes everything. The awakened no longer feels compelled to correct or respond. They understand that when someone speaks unconsciously, it's not a debate to be won, but a pain to be understood. Silence becomes their medicine. It allows space for the other person's noise to dissolve on its own. Sometimes, without even saying a word, the awakened helps others glimpse their own stillness. This is why their presence feels peaceful. They do not add to the noise of the world. They simply embody the quiet beneath it. But this quiet presence often makes others uneasy. In a society addicted to conversation, silence feels like confrontation. People interpret the awakened's stillness as disinterest, even arrogance. Yet, the awakened carries no judgment. They simply cannot return to the old rhythm, the rhythm of talking without listening, of filling space instead of feeling it. They know that once you have heard the music of silence, ordinary chatter becomes unbearable. Alan Watts once said, "We seldom realize that our most private thoughts and emotions are not actually our own." The awakened understands this, and so, they no longer mistake noise for connection. Their silence, then, is not the end of communication, but its rebirth. It invites depth where there was only surface, awareness where there was only habit. It's an open door, not a closed one. Through it, the awakened reminds us that we do not need to speak to connect. We only need to be present. And in that presence, even the smallest glance can say what 1,000 words never could. Over time, the awakened one learns to use words differently, not as a shield, but as a bridge. When they do speak, it is not to impress or to control, but to awaken something dormant in others. Alan Watts believed that words are like fingers pointing to the moon. The mistake, he said, is when we stare at the finger instead of seeing where it points. The awakened understands this intimately. They use words not to define truth, but to guide others toward the space where truth already lives, within themselves. Every sentence they speak becomes an invitation, a reminder, a gentle nudge toward awareness. They have also learned that true communication begins long before a word is spoken. It begins in energy, in intention, in presence. The awakened knows that people do not remember what you say. They remember how they felt in your presence. And so, they speak from stillness, from grounded awareness. Even their silence feels communicative. Their energy carries meaning that language cannot touch. This is why, when an awakened person does speak, their words often linger. Not because they are poetic, but because they are true. The more they awaken, the more they see how most people speak only to defend the ego. Every argument, every justification, every piece of gossip is a way of saying, I exist and I am right. The awakened smiles at this, not in mockery, but in recognition. They remember when they too used words as armor. But now, they have laid that armor down. They understand that truth doesn't need defending, and silence doesn't need justification. In the end, the awakened no longer seeks to win conversations. They seek to dissolve them. This does not mean they withdraw completely. They still speak, but their speech feels different, slower, softer, yet more powerful. Their pauses are not awkward, but magnetic. Listeners lean in, drawn by something they can't explain. Alan Watts would call this the music of consciousness, the way truth sings through anyone who has become empty enough to let it. The awakened has become that instrument, tuned to stillness, played by existence itself. And so, they move through the world speaking rarely, but meaningfully. Every word they utter feels intentional, alive. They have no need for small talk because every conversation is sacred. Every exchange an echo of the divine dialogue between awareness and itself. Through them, language returns to its original purpose, not to fill silence, but to honor it. At a certain depth of awakening, even meaningful conversation begins to take on a different texture. The awakened one no longer seeks to exchange ideas but to share presence. Alan Watts often said that communication at its highest form is communion, a merging rather than a discussion. When two awakened beings meet, words become almost unnecessary. A simple look, a shared silence, a breath between them holds more truth than hours of dialogue ever could. They don't talk about life. They are life, expressing itself in quiet recognition. But in a world that worships sound, this kind of connection seems strange. Most people equate silence with emptiness and chatter with connection. They measure relationships by words exchanged, not by awareness shared. The awakened sees through this illusion and chooses depth over volume. They'd rather have one moment of genuine presence than a lifetime of shallow words. In their silence, they feel connected to everything, to the pulse of the earth, to the rhythm of breath, to the divine intelligence that hums beneath all existence. For them, silence is not the absence of conversation. It is the purest form of it. Through this awareness, the awakened begins to understand that small talk is not the problem. Unconsciousness is. Words themselves are innocent. What gives them weight, or emptiness, is the state of being from which they arise. The awakened could talk about the weather and still be speaking truth, if their words flow from presence. And someone else could speak about enlightenment, but still be lost, if their words come from ego. Alan Watts pointed to this paradox often, that the content of a conversation means little compared to the consciousness behind it. This is why, even though the awakened avoid small talk, they're not rigid or distant. They can laugh, tell stories, and speak lightly when needed, but behind every word, there is awareness. They never lose themselves in the sound. It's as if they're both the speaker and the silence watching the speaker. Their laughter, even when soft, carries depth. Their words, even when simple, carry vibration. They exist in the world but are no longer trapped by its noise. Watts would call this the dance of life, where you are both the dancer and the dance. To those who encounter them, the awakened may seem mysterious, someone who says little but communicates much. But that mystery is not withholding, it is freedom. They have transcended the need to be understood through words because they live in the truth that understanding is not intellectual, it is energetic. Their avoidance of small talk, then, is not an escape from others, but a return to reality. It's the quiet refusal to engage in illusions, and the gentle choice to live in presence instead. Eventually, the awakened reaches a point where they no longer choose silence. Silence simply is. It becomes their natural state, the background of every word, the space from which all expression arises. Alan Watts described enlightenment as the realization that the ground of being and the self are not two. The awakened now lives from that ground. They no longer see communication as something happening between people, but within the one consciousness expressing itself in many forms. Speech, silence, laughter, tears, all are seen as waves upon the same ocean. In this realization, small talk loses its power to distract or drain. The awakened can listen to it without resistance, without the urge to correct or escape. They see it for what it is, the dance of humanity, the hum of life still unaware of its source. And in that seeing, compassion blossoms. They understand that not everyone is ready for silence, and that's okay. The awakened doesn't force depth upon others. They simply embody it. Their stillness becomes an invitation, a reminder that there is more beyond the surface. Some will feel that pull toward silence, others will not. Both are perfect expressions of the same whole. When the awakened do speak, their words carry a strange magic. They no longer come from thought, but from knowing. Their voice, calm and measured, feels like a bridge between the seen and the unseen. Even ordinary sentences carry subtle wisdom, as though life itself were speaking through them. Alan once said, "The sound of rain needs no translation." The awakened's words are like that, simple, direct, and true, resonating with something deep inside those who listen. And so, their avoidance of small talk is no longer a conscious act. It's the natural result of clarity. They have returned to the original language of existence, stillness. Their communication flows from that silence and returns to it, like breath. Every interaction becomes sacred, whether spoken or wordless. The awakened knows that connection does not depend on expression, it depends on awareness. And in awareness, even silence becomes eloquent. In the end, they have learned the secret that Alan Watts spent his life revealing, that to truly communicate, one must first stop talking. For in the space between words lies the truth we are all trying to express, that there is no separation, no other, no need to fill the silence. There is only this moment, vast, infinite, and perfectly enough. There comes a moment in awakening when the awakened one no longer distinguishes between silence and speech, between conversation and contemplation. Both become expressions of the same truth. Alan Watts often said, "You are not listening to the rain, you are the rain." The awakened lives this understanding. When they speak, it is life speaking through them. When they are silent, it is life resting in itself. Every moment becomes communication, not between individuals, but within consciousness itself. There is no longer an observer and the observed, no longer someone who talks and someone who listens. There is only awareness flowing, effortlessly, as sound and silence intertwine. This realization transforms how they move through the world. They can sit in the middle of a busy cafe, surrounded by endless conversation, and still feel the stillness within. Words move around them like waves, but they are the ocean, vast, unmoved, embracing everything. The chatter no longer disturbs them. It becomes part of the music of existence. They don't resist it, but neither do they lose themselves in it. They have learned to let sound come and go as freely as thought. In that freedom, even small talk becomes sacred, not because of its content, but because it too is life expressing itself. From this space, the awakened no longer avoid small talk out of rejection. They transcend it. They can engage with anyone, at any level, without being pulled into illusion. Their presence transforms the conversation. What begins as casual talk about weather or daily life slowly deepens, naturally, as if the soul itself leans closer. People find themselves opening up without knowing why, saying things they've never said before. It's not the words that change, it's the energy. The awakened one doesn't preach or guide, they embody. Through their being, they remind others what it feels like to speak from truth. This embodiment radiates calm. It's not something they do, it's something they are. Their silence between words becomes a mirror, reflecting back the stillness that lives in everyone else. Alan Watts once noted that the true spiritual master doesn't teach, they remind. The awakened understands this deeply. By simply existing in awareness, they awaken awareness in others. A single moment of their presence can shift a lifetime of unconsciousness. That is the power of silence in motion. It teaches without effort, heals without trying. And so, the awakened no longer avoids or seeks conversation. They simply meet life as it comes. Whether in words or quiet, they are at peace. They know that real connection has nothing to do with how much is said, but how deeply one is there. In their company, even silence feels like dialogue, rich, alive, and endlessly meaningful. What once was small talk becomes divine play, the universe speaking to itself through laughter, through pauses, through the ordinary moments we once overlooked. At the highest stage of awareness, speech and silence merge into one continuous truth. The awakened no longer measures value by depth or simplicity, by profound ideas or mundane exchanges. They see that all of it, every word spoken, every silence held, arises from the same infinite source. Allen once captured this beautifully when he said, "The real you is not a puppet that life pushes around. The real, deep down you is the whole universe." The awakened lives from that realization. They no longer speak about the universe. They speak as it. Because of this, they move through the world with gentle reverence. Conversations that once seemed trivial now shimmer with hidden meaning. A casual, "good morning," contains the entire cosmos. Every exchange, no matter how simple, becomes an opportunity for awareness to meet awareness. The awakened no longer avoid small talk. They sanctify it. They know that enlightenment doesn't reject the ordinary. It reveals its sacredness. What others see as meaningless chatter, they experience as the universe expressing its endless creativity in human form. This awareness dissolves all resistance. The awakened stops searching for spiritual conversations and starts finding truth in every sound, every word, every silence. They can listen to a stranger speak about daily life and hear the rhythm of existence beneath it. They can respond with kindness, not because they feel obligated, but because compassion now flows effortlessly. They no longer seek to teach or correct. They simply reflect. And in that reflection, others feel something stir within them, a remembering, faint but familiar, of who they truly are. Allen once often said that the greatest teachers are those who make you realize you never needed one. The awakened embodies that. Their avoidance of small talk has matured into an effortless acceptance of all talk, because they no longer see separation between shallow and deep, sacred and mundane. Everything is divine expression, and every encounter, however brief, becomes an echo of eternity. The awakened smiles gently at this paradox, that the silence they once sought now speaks through everything. In the end, the awakened no longer cares whether the world speaks or falls silent. They're at home in both. They see that life was never trying to be profound. It was simply trying to be. And so they rest in that beingness, where no words are necessary, yet everything is already said. As Watts would whisper from beyond the noise, when you realize that you are what you seek, all talk becomes laughter, and all silence love. In the end, the reason the awakened avoid small talk is not because they reject the world. It's because they've finally learned to listen to it. Beyond the noise, beyond the rehearsed exchanges and surface pleasantries, they hear something deeper, the silent heartbeat of existence. They understand that true communication begins where words end. Every pause, every breath, every moment of stillness holds a kind of truth that cannot be spoken, only felt. The awakened no longer seeks conversation for comfort. They seek presence, for in presence, the soul speaks more clearly than any language ever could. All the noise we once chased begins to fade when we awaken. We realize that much of what we called connection was just a way to avoid ourselves. The awakened see through this illusion and return to something pure, awareness without pretense, listening without expectation. They no longer speak to fill silence. They speak to honor it. And in that silence, they rediscover the sacredness of life itself. The understanding that being is enough, that silence is not emptiness, but fullness, overflowing with meaning. Allen once said, "The sound of rain needs no translation." The awakened finally understand what he meant. They learn that every person they meet, every conversation they once dismissed as small, is still part of the same great dance. The difference now is awareness. They no longer listen to reply, but to feel. They see the divine even in the mundane, in a stranger's smile, in a child's laughter, in a moment of shared quiet. To the awakened, life itself becomes one long conversation between consciousness and its reflection. Words may come and go, but understanding remains, unspoken yet eternal. And perhaps that is the true essence of awakening. Not speaking less, but speaking from truth. Not rejecting the world, but seeing through it. The awakened don't avoid small talk because they're distant. They simply crave authenticity in a world that fears silence. They remind us that communication was never meant to be noise. It was meant to be communion. The more we awaken, the more we realize that we were never talking to others at all. We were always talking to ourselves, disguised in 1,000 different voices. If this reflection stirred something within you, that quiet recognition that you, too, have grown tired of noise, perhaps it's because you're beginning to hear what's beneath it. Stay with that silence. Listen to it. And if you felt resonance in this message, take a moment to share it, not just with others, but with yourself. Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts below, and let this space be a place of depth, of truth, of presence. Because sometimes, the most powerful conversations are the ones that happen in silence.